As we inch closer and closer to Shadow of the Erdtree's release date, I've been noticing an uptick in people making videos about the DLC adding covenants, which is something I think I just talked about in my last video or two, but I recall it came in the midst of various ramblings and ravings about both real and made-up stats in Elden Ring, so instead I'll just summarize my overall point here. I really don't think we're getting covenants in the DLC. I'm not saying it's impossible, I just think it's quite unlikely, and the reason why I think it's unlikely is honestly less important than my overall point, which is that covenants aren't going to suddenly make you actually like Elden Ring PvP. Essentially, you cannot fill that covenant-shaped hole in your heart because it's not actually covenant-shaped. But first, a tangent. So there's something that my parents used to do when I was a child, and actually they still do this to this day, where they'll come up to me and say, "Thank me right now." And I'd say, "For what? Why am I thanking you? What have you done?" It was almost always something like fairly nice or pleasant enough that they did for me, but it was never something I would have actually had to say thank you for. I might say, "Oh, thanks," or "Oh, nice," but my parents wanted a full-on thank you for these things, which was always a little ridiculous. The whole thing was always kind of a joke. That being said, you should thank me right now for not making the thumbnail saying something in bright green or yellow text, "DLC could fix this," or "Covenants?" in all caps. I could even do a face reveal and do a big red arrow and then put a bunch of the Covenant crests from Dark Souls 3 or Dark Souls 1 or something like that, and it's "This could save Elden Ring PvP," or some dumb shit like that. But I didn't. And you should all thank me for that. That's right, go into the comments right now and say "thank you" and call me all of your funny names like Ruffles the Gorp, or Roblox the Gym, or Robo the Gruyere. I could have so easily made this the most clickbaity thumbnail of all time, but instead I didn't, because I chose to respect you, the viewer. Much like Yui Tanamura respects you, the player, by stuffing the Iron Keep full of 5 billion Elan Knights. Since I'm busy tangenting, I'll be very quick about the usual "here's my build" spiel. This is the blue blood tinge build that you've all seen a couple of times, but I had my guys run the numbers, and I'm really not getting incredible returns on having 40 int versus 30 int on this build at rune level 81. So what I did was I just got 20 strength and 20 dexterity, and then dumped my remaining allocated points for damage into intelligence, which netted me about 30 int or so. This essentially allows me to use all of my favorite hybrid int and physical weapons, as well as some of my favorite Ash of War pairings like Gravitas on a Magic Omen Cleaver. Lately I've become quite fond of the single Naginata, and I've tried to make it my main weapon for this build by using Storm Assault as my get off me Ash of War. I've paired pretty much everything in my main hand with an offhand cold Wakizashi, which I keep around for the status effect buildup on dagger spam, which actually works twofold with the cold infused Wakizashi because it has innate bleed and then infused cold buildup. In general, this is an extremely weeby build, but I've come to accept that I'm currently in my Weeb era until at least June. Several months ago, I watched Blue Eyes Samurai on Netflix, and then Shogun has been premiering these last many weeks, and in May, Ghost of Tsushima comes to PC, so it's been a lot of Sengoku era Japan injected directly into my bloodstream as of late. Hell, I might as well just replay Sekiro while I'm at it and just fully embrace that this is who I am at the moment. It also just occurred to me that Miyazaki mentioned there will be a new type of larger weapon category called the Odachi in Shadow of the Erdtree, so this Weeb era might just keep rolling on right through June anyways. But I promise you, despite having the Moonveil on this build, I shall not be using it all that often, in a video at the very least. I'm currently calling this build the Celion Onryu, which I named shortly after watching Blue Eyes Samurai. I struggled to see the difference between Blue Eye Samurai's Onryu and Sekiro's Shura, as both seem to be their own versions of people consumed by hatred and killing. So I did a little research on it and found that Onryu is sometimes translated to Dark Spirit, and hey, that's me. That's exactly what an invader is in these games. Also, since Shura seems to be closely linked to fire in Fromsoft lore, I went with Onryu since this character is linked to Celia and thus a lot of magic damage. Speaking of magic, I've taken to using the spells I meet the requirements for at 30 intelligence as utilities rather than my primary means of doing damage on this build. Of course, there's Night Maiden's Mist, an ever useful spell, but have actually begun to really like Great Glintstone Shard in order to shut down other magic users charging up their large projectiles that will surely have my health if they hit. I also use Unseen Form here and there, paired with Trick Mirror, to be a little bit more stealthy. I seem to have a habit of lying my ass off when I say I'm going to take a brief tangent to talk about a build, because I always have so much more to say than I originally let on. But anyways, back to the whole Covenants discussion. So let's pick up where we left off with Covenants in Elden Ring. Essentially, Covenants aren't going to fill that balance-shaped hole in all of your hearts. You see Covenants as if it'd suddenly make invading fun, but the reality is that Covenants don't make invading fun, they can make it more interesting, but they really don't do anything to change the core combat of the game. Sure, there's a litany of other reasons why Covenants are fun and cool, but if you're holding out hope that the DLC will add Covenants and then suddenly Elden Ring will become a game that you actually like, then you're going to end up disappointed and likely hollow. People also seem to act like Dark Souls 3's Covenants really added so much to the game, when I don't think they really made much of an impact at all. And in fact, I'd argue that they were just the same two Covenants with slightly different coats of paint and very little else. For example, there were two blue Covenants with separate lore and separate Covenant crests, and very slightly different colors that did exactly the same thing. We had the orange Invader Sunbros that, as it turned out, were entirely indistinguishable in every aspect of their Covenant, except that they got a sunlight medal instead of a tongue for winning an invasion. And that long-held myth about them being more likely to get a co-invasion turned out to be proven to be false. Oh, but what about the Mound Makers, the Covenant that was supposed to be this chaotic cross between an Invader Covenant and a Summoning Covenant? Well, that didn't really amount to much either, since Mound Maker's win conditions also seemed to be one less total Phantoms than were present in an invasion. So if there was a party of 3, you'd get your shackle for killing 2 of the Phantoms present, or if there was a party of 3 and 1 co-invader, you'd get your shackle for killing 1 Phantom and 1 co-invader, or something like that. It was a little irregular and was typically just annoying because I don't want to get sent home after killing everyone except the host. If I went through all of the trouble of murdering everyone in the world, I probably want to kill the host too. And it's not like the Fingers of Rosaria was a super impactful Covenant either. All the invaders that I watched on YouTube and know personally all had some 699 tongues in their inventory on quite a few of their characters. Did they take the time to kill thousands of hosts because they were super into simping for Rosaria and wanted to become a little worm? No, it's because they enjoyed playing the PvP in this game. A Covenant with lore really wasn't going to sway them one way or the other. And it's essentially what we have in Elden Ring anyways. The big ones I'm leaving out here are obviously the auto-summoning Invader Covenants tied to different areas in the game. I've been arguing with some of my Invader friends who insist that the Watchdogs and Eldritches are crucial parts of the Invader ecosystem and add something dynamic to the experience of invading alongside them. Mind you, those exact same Invader friends spent the better part of 6 years bemoaning the absolute idiocy of those that don the Watchdog crest, typing many a "fucking Watchdogs" and "you dipshit Watchdogs, we have the same goal" in my Discord server. Given the state of Elden Ring PvP, where your average co-invader attacks you on sight despite sharing the same goal, makes me think that perhaps Watchdogs were the precursor to Elden Ring invaders. I will note that I do feel quite differently about Eldritch invaders, who tended to possess far greater competency and likely more grooves on their brain than the average Watchdog. My theory on this is that the Watchdogs of Farron Covenant Crest is extremely easy to find, acquire, and equip, thus enabling the mouth breathers of Dark Souls 3 to enter this Covenant. Whereas the Eldritch Crest lies behind an illusory wall down an extremely long ladder and is guarded by 2 Berserk reference dogs, and thus many of the vacuous Watchdogs simply never acquired that particular Covenant Crest. But in general, I feel like Watchdogs and Eldritches really only added like one slight component to invasions, which is sometimes there were 3 invaders present instead of just 2. Sure, there's some wrinkles where, like, you know, if there's 2 Eldritches, they don't have friendly fire with each other, and that's neat. It just never amounted to that much in terms of how invasions actually played out. I'm taking all of this time to shit on all of Dark Souls 3's Covenants because none of them were really all that impactful to how multiplayer functioned. The only exception I'd make here is Spears of the Church, because that was a fundamentally different invasion experience with different rules for both the host and invader. The same cannot really be said for any of Dark Souls 3's other Covenants. If you want to get into some actually different Invader Covenants, then let's talk about Dark Souls 1 and 2's Covenants, who executed on this idea dramatically better. Hell, I'd even throw Bloodborne in the mix for their rivalry between Vilebloods and Executioners, but I think that ended up being more confusing to your average player as a whole. What I'm trying to impart to all of you is that if just the base experience of a regular invasion in this game isn't enjoyable for you, then almost none of Dark Souls 3's Covenant would likely be impactful enough to suddenly make you start liking the game. I should also add that I am nearly certain that Aldriches and Watchdog type auto-summoning Covenants won't be added in Shadow of the Erdtree. This assumption is mostly based on the world player cap likely not being raised from 4 players to 6, and that is due to the Gen 8 console still being part of Shadow of the Erdtree. I've explained this before, but the reason that the player cap was likely lowered was because Gen 8 consoles like the PS4 and Xbox One really struggled with their performance with 6 players present in the world. Anyways, that's my daisy chain of logic about why we likely won't see an auto-summoning Invader Covenant that co-invades alongside Recusant and Bloody Fingers. Please don't mistake what I'm trying to say here as saying that I don't want Covenants in Elden Ring, because I really, really do. But I more so am trying to temper some of your expectations out there to be more realistic about what you can expect and what you actually want out of this. Personally, I'd really love if we got something like Spears of the Church again, but I'm really holding out hope for both the DS2 Rat Covenant and the real Blades of the Dark Moon from Dark Souls 1. The reason these covenants are on my wish list is because I feel like they would actually fundamentally change how an invasion works, but also they seem like they could be easily implemented into Elden Ring without breaking too many of the current systems. For example, the Rat Covenant would be relatively easy to implement. Hell, you could even just make it a singular or series of dedicated underground tombs or dungeons where invaders could activate traps to use for themselves, but also make it so that the only way that players can get out of that tomb or dungeon is to kill the invader. As for Dark Souls 1 style Blades of the Dark Moon, I see no reason as to why this hasn't existed since Dark Souls 2. Like, invaders want more PvP, so why not make them invadable at all times by other invaders? I think what I want the most from Covenants in Elden Ring is the ability to roleplay, and being a gremlin who rules their lair with their tricks and traps, or a hunter of hunters, so to speak, would definitely contribute to that feeling of roleplaying and involving oneself in that multiplayer ecosystem. Actually, I'm really just hoping that Fromsoft implements some multiplayer features that actually push invasions forward as a mechanic, instead of just doing exactly what's been done before. In fact, I would encourage us as a community to look to the future instead of the past when suggesting or demanding changes from Software. This is something that I've kind of noticed is very common within this community, and something that I've definitely been guilty of myself. What I mean is that whenever the community doesn't like something new in current From Software games, they always point to a mechanic or feature from past games that they deem to be superior and then start frothing at the mouth and demanding them on the internet. For example, we suffered through Dark Souls 3's long life cycle of FromSoft fans demanding that passive poise be re-implemented in future games. Lo and behold, we got exactly that in Elden Ring, and it was abysmal. Poise simply didn't make sense in a game whose combat was as fast and paced as Elden Ring's. Another one would be power stancing, something that Dark Souls 2 fans had been begging for, and apparently Dark Souls 3's paired weapons weren't good enough for them. So we got power stancing in Elden Ring, and Jesus Christ, I would take paired weapons any day of the week over the absurd motion values and stupid movesets we currently have on power stance weapons. Obviously, I think both of these examples could be mitigated with proper balancing, but even then I don't think they fit well with Elden Ring's holistic combat experience. So maybe the solution to our Shadow of the Erdtree Covenant issue isn't to look solely to the past for answers. Perhaps we should be hoping for something that at least advances the genre of invasions. When content creators were making all of their posts about things they wanted FromSoft to change about invasions, within the first year after launch, they made all kinds of requests that I just kind of disagreed with entirely, like making anyone with a rune arc active invadable, or making solo host invasions a thing again, changes that seemed like they were really just requesting the game go back to Dark Souls 3's rules of invasions. But one of their ideas for changes was that invaders could take the effects of their rune arcs into invasions with them, something that I actually thought was a really cool idea. Now, from a balance perspective, this might be a nightmare, as taking Godric's rune into any invasion under rune level 70 or so immediately provides you with a massive advantage due to the sheer number of stats you add to your build. But I think there are ways that it could be mitigated at lower levels, and nonetheless, I think there's a lot of potential here. If you're an invader whose build is already good to go, then Morgoth's rune is probably your best bet. Or if your build needs heavier armor or weapons, then Radahn's would probably be ideal. Say you're making a Rings caster or a Magma caster, then Godric's would be quite helpful. But you could also make some weirdo self-healing builds and stack the Godskin Swaddling Cloth and Melania's Rune together and get some actually impactful self-healing buffs from invasions. I think Mohg's Rune is such a cool idea in concept, but in practice ends up really only being useful for bleed builds, a type of build I find to be boring and ubiquitous with Elden Ring's current balance. So I guess what I'm really hoping for in Shadow of the Erdtree is more Invader runes with unique effects. I know that's unlikely since all of the Shard Bearers seem to be present in the current framework of the story, and I don't really know what other shards would be ours to claim. I'm just so on board with embracing new mechanics that we haven't fully explored yet, instead of living in this nostalgic state about a game that we all spent like 6 years playing. My general philosophy is that maybe we shouldn't just constantly be asking for the same thing we had last game. I know it's not as simple as this, but I think if we just want the last game but with a new story and bosses and armor over and over again, I think we'll just end up with Ubisoft-ass feeling games, which is not what anyone wants here. I think what we all love about Fromsoft is that they seem willing to make pretty drastic changes in pretty much all of their games, even if that means tossing out some of the stuff we liked from a previous game. Like, every single iteration of the Dark Souls series had pretty much wildly different PvP than the next one. It's like they're constantly experimenting with it. And sure, Elden Ring's PvP is a disappointment in quite a few ways, but I really don't think the solution is just to make sure that all of its multiplayer mechanics return to the forms that we've already sunk thousands of hours into. I'm far more hopeful that Fromsoft has something else in mind for how to change up multiplayer, and if not in Shadow of the Erdtree, then perhaps in the future games that they decide to make. So yeah, I don't expect any of you to really start sharing this philosophy or even to agree with a lot of what I said, especially with how some of you seem to hold DS3 in such a high regard. Like, seriously, that game had a ton of flaws, just like any other game in the Souls series, but people seem to pretend it was the peak of all Souls combat, and I don't know, I think people are pretty quick to forget the litany of issues that Dark Souls 3 had because Elden Ring just has more. Like, look, I really loved Dark Souls 3. It was like the main game I played for 6 years. But after that time, I've kind of gotten absolutely everything I ever wanted to get out of that game, and don't really see myself returning to it anytime soon. I legitimately don't think that game was meant to be played that long, and I think it kind of rotted my brain a bit, and I think it rotted quite a few people's brains as well in the Souls community. I just don't think these games are meant to be like focused on and squeezed to the degree that we currently do. I think they're made to be played for fun and then to kind of just move on from. A joke I've heard once or twice in Pinko's stream, I think, was that I can't wait for Elden Ring 2 so that we can finally start to say that we like Elden Ring Invasions. That might be like an overly reductive take of the general sentiment of the, PvP community for From Software games. But I think it's easy to fall into this trap of just being like, oh, this older thing used to be so good and now it's ruined. And instead just embrace that things must and will change whether you like it or not. That's like the general philosophy of a lot of FromSoft's games' main stories in the first place. And to oppose that is to stagnate and rot. There are plenty of people who devote their entire mindsets to opposing change and demanding that we return to how things once were. And those people are called conservatives, and everybody fucking hates them. Anyways, that's all from me, guys. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.